Welcome to Recross the Paths, a compact cube conversation with curators and designers. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to Greg's cube and for cards referenced during this episode. Hello, my name is Cade. I am here with Greg Cortazzo, the designer of the Companion Cube, and today we're going to talk a little bit about that cube and the design decisions that led to its existence. Hello, Greg.
Hi, Cade. How you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for taking your time to talk a little bit about this project.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited to be here.
Give us the elevator pitch for the Companion Cube.
Sure. So Companion Cube is a cube where you can companion anything according to the original companion rules. That's the elevator pitch, as it were. So you draft as normal, you build your deck as normal, and at the beginning of each game, you're going to simultaneously with your opponent reveal a card from your sideboard that will act as your companion for that game, and you can play it right out of the sideboard, like the companion rule used to work before the errata.
And the natural follow-up question is, wait, Greg, you mean any card?
Yes, any card. Does not have to be a creature. It doesn't even have to be a spell. Lands are allowed, which can make for some pretty interesting deck building decisions when it comes to how many lands do you actually want to put in your deck if there's one that's always in your opening hand.
So this is a wonderful and wild design concept. How did you come to this idea?
About a year ago, I started getting sort of back into Cube, more into the Cube scene as it exists today. And so I started traveling to Magic Cons in order to meet some other Cube people. So last February at this point was Magic Con Philadelphia. And I met a lot of cool people there, a lot of people who had really cool cubes. And I had the experience of drafting Zach Barish's Cascade Cube, which was featured at CubeCon this past year, as well as Ryan Sachs's Build Around Cube.
And for those who don't know, the Cascade Cube also has a unique rule, which is
Yes, the first everyone starts with a Maelstrom Nexus emblem. So the first spell that you cast on any turn has Cascade. So I had a ton of fun with those cubes. Had I had so much fun meeting all these people. I wanted to create something that could be in this kind of space. I also drafted the Devoid Cube for the first time during that trip. Just all kinds of really creative projects, new and exciting ideas, and I wanted to make something that could do that as well.
so. How long did it take for you to arrive at at this kind of rules change? Was it as simple as what do people want to do? Was there like a bunch of scrawled notes on a whiteboard? How'd you land here?
Well, I think other than the cubes that I experienced at MagicCon Philly, the other biggest uh, inspiration for this project was an episode of Lucky Paper Radio that was about commander cubes. And at some point during that episode, Andy briefly floated the idea, well, how can we fix the color identity rule in draft? Because a lot of commander cubes you'll see have modified color identity rules because it's difficult to draft a legend and then draft a deck that fits within the subset of all those colors, right? And so he theory crafted for a second, like, oh, what if we got rid of the color identity rule? Or what if we just like got rid of your commander has to be legendary? Or what if we even got rid of your commander has to be a creature? And so I'm thinking, oh, that's kind of cool. Like you could commander whatever you want, right? Like a spell, like an Oathbreaker, or maybe just some kind of cool build around artifact. And I was thinking about some of the cards that I saw in the build around cube. And one of the reasons I don't like Commander very much is because of the repetitive play patterns of casting your commander over and over again from the command zone. And so I thought if I were to build a cube like that, I would probably just say you can only cast your commander one time, which would make it function much more similarly to the companion rule, right? You're just casting it straight out of your sideboard, and then it's just part of the game. If it dies, it goes to your graveyard. If it's exiled, it's gone, whatever. And so that was kind of how I arrived towards the companion rules change for the cube. And I was talking to my girlfriend about, I was just kind of, theory crafting out loud. And she was like, oh, companion cube. And I was like, companion cube, right? Like weighted companion cube from Portal. So like once once we strung together like the words companion cube, it was like, we have to build the cube now. Like we have to put it in a box that looks like a companion cube. We have to like that's the whole thing.
So once you had this concept in place, when you were building it, were you considering how each card fits into that rule, or was it a little more broad? Like I want to build an environment and then add this rule to it.
So I had a very strange design process for this cube that I probably wouldn't recommend in general. What I did here was I had a completely different cube that I had built probably 4 years prior that I was no longer very happy with. And I was thinking, okay, I should probably test out this companion thing to see how it works. Like I just want to play with a cube and add the companion rule just so I can get a feel for what does the rule do to the cube, right? Um, and so I took this old cube out of my closet and I was like, let's just draft this and use the companion rule and see what happens. And we did that. And from there, I took this cube, which by the way was like 800 cards, and I
Well, hold on, that's a big sidebar, but
yeah.
continue.
Well, so this cube is like, well, that's useful here to me because I got to cut hundreds of cards out of the cube that I thought were no good for the companion cube project, right? So I kind of did this thing where I started with this giant block of marble and like carved the cube out of it because I had this cube laying around already, and that was just my testing ground for the rules change. And then like you can go back in the history of the companion cube Cobra page and see like it was just a random assortment of cards basically at the beginning because they came from this other cube, and then from there I just made changes until all of the cards that were originally there were gone basically.
Is that a design process that you've used for any other environments that you've worked on or are working on?
No, not at all. I kind of just stumbled into it because it was a rules change that I wanted to test, and I already had a cube laying around.
Something you don't hear often. I just had an extra cube lying around that I could test with.
Yeah, well, I that cube, it was called Spice Cube, and it was something that we drafted in college for a while, and it had started getting very bloated. As I mentioned, it was way too big. It also had tons of like uncards and like weird extra rules. Like there was a fractured power stone in there that I allowed you to roll the planar die with, and like there was a booster tutor and draft matters cards and like all kinds of crazy junk, right? And that was the kind of stuff that we were having fun with in college. But as I listened to Lucky Paper basically and started to get a feel for like what my ideal magic looks like the more competitive side that I enjoy, I realized that this cube was like not the kind of magic that I wanted to be playing. And so I just, I threw it in the closet. I cloned the Bun Magic cube. I start building my atomic cube out of the Bun Magic cube. And so that cube was kind of just laying there forgotten. And so I crafted it into companion cube.
So you mentioned a phrase that I think is really really cool here. You said the ideal magic that you wanted to play. What kind of play patterns are you looking for? What do you expect people to do, or what do you hope people will do when they pick up a cube like yours, like the companion cube?
Well, I definitely have a hope for what happens when someone picks up the cube for the first time, which is open a pack or just rifle through the cube as we're shuffling and say, wow, I can't wait to companion this card or this card or this card. I really love like explaining the rules change, and then people like you can see the gears turning, because everybody has a card that they love from constructed or a card that they like playing in cube or whatever that they really want to be able to build around. And a lot of the cards in this cube come from iconic constructed decks, and so people will just look at the cube and say, oh, lightning bolt, goblin guide, thoughtseize, counterspell, whatever it is, like this is my favorite card. Or sometimes it's something weird, sometimes it's Allurin or something like that, right? And there's like, oh, I can't wait to open this, like I can't wait to draft this card. That actually reminds me of another inspiration that brought this cube to fruition, which was Dom Harvey on Lucky Paper talking about how he loves Amulet Titan, essentially his iconic constructed deck that he's well known for playing very well. And he was lamenting essentially that you can't make Amulet of Vigor work in cube because it's such a narrow build around and it needs to be so consistently drawn, and like the card doesn't really do anything unless you're doing all these bounce lands and prime times and things, right? And like he really loves that deck and was never able to make it work in a drafted environment. And so that was another huge inspiration for me, was how can I make Amulet of Vigor work in this cube, like like that specific card, because having heard somebody's story of this is a card I love to play in constructed, but I just can't make it work in cube. Those were the kinds of cards that I wanted to make shine in this cube.
And Dom Harvey, a famous proponent of this cube, I believe, seeks actively to draft it as often as possible, rumored to be making his own clone of or variant of.
That is true. I got a bit of a shout out on his podcast, and he has drafted this cube, not quite more than me, but definitely second most out of anyone.
But you noted with people having pet cards, do you find that your players, your drafters, or you lock into particular companions that are aiming for? Do they change game to game, draft to draft?
I think it depends. People who are drafting it for the first time do definitely gravitate towards those cards that they like in other contexts. But some people who have drafted it more times are going to be like, oh, I'll try this new companion. I've never done this before. Or I saw someone do something really cool with this last draft. I'm going to give that a try. Meanwhile, I'm always drafting whatever I just put into the cube, as I'm sure many cube curators do.
What have been some of the most surprising draft or play patterns you've seen? Because I know you have an expectation going in. What have you not expected?
I think what I really love about this cube that I wasn't necessarily intending from the get go was the ability to blend together archetypes so effectively. Um, I remember an early test draft where I put together this Cascade deck with a companion Shardless Agent, like Rhinos kind of thing. But then I also had Wilderness Reclamation and Nexus of Fate and Capsize and doing that kind of stuff, right? So I had this plan A of Cascade, make some Rhinos, and then if my opponent can kill the Rhinos and invalidate my companion, then I'll turn into Temur Reclamation afterwards. And I think that's really cool. I think the ability to draft like multiple archetypes, but the archetypes are all famous decks kind of thing. It makes for a really exciting draft experience because people are like, oh, I've blended together this cool modern deck that I like alongside this like these other synergy pieces from a legacy interaction that I think is really cool.
So in that spirit, and as you're talking about designing this cube or whittling it down, carving it from marble, what kind of cards make for the best companions?
In terms of win rate, the best companions tend to be cheaper cards in terms of mana cost. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is that the more expensive a card is, the less important it is for you to cast it on curve, right? Like when somebody puts together a control deck in this cube, if they're choosing between companioning like Hullbreaker Horror versus Counterspell, like usually Counterspell is the good bet because you want to have Counterspell in your hand from the get go, but you don't actually care about casting Hullbreaker Horror on turn 7. You can cast it on turn 9 and it'll still win you the game. But as far as other types of cards that aren't so cheap, the next best thing to be doing, or possibly in contention for also the best thing to be doing, are just like the most powerful build arounds. So if someone's brand new to the cube and they're like, what should I companion? I usually say companion a 1-drop or like a 4-drop that's going to win you the game when you cast it. And that's like sort of a decent heuristic, I think. Stuff like Allurin makes for a really good companion. Those sorts of like really busted build arounds are also good.
So then I guess the extension of that question is what sorts of cards would yield the most compelling decisions during draft and deck building?
Hmm. I think there's a lot of those. I think that's one of the things that's fun about this cube is there's a lot of weird build arounds that you're not really sure how you're going to get there. I did mention Allurin already. So Allurin is a card that like you've got your Cavern Harpy in here, but there's no Parasitic Strix, there's no Acererak. So you can find the Cavern Harpy in the Allurin, but then you kind of have to work for it. Like you can do it with Croxa, you can do it with Cauldron Familiar, you can do it with Uro. I saw one drafter at CubeCon who like couldn't find a win condition for their Allurin deck, so they put Tidehollow Sculler in, and they were like, "I'm just going to exile my opponent's hand every single turn, and find a way to win from there."
Well, that's a good
uh,
start.
yeah, so that kind of stuff is really cool. Like Displacer Kitten is another one. Teshar is one of my favorites. Like these kinds of cards that you don't know exactly what they do as you're drafting them, but you can find these like emergent synergies with them. Tameshi is another great example. Um, yeah, I really love those kinds of cards where they make you think. And the power level ceiling on a lot of those cards is also really high. Like you can go infinite with Displacer Kitten in this cube, but you also can just like play Displacer Kitten in your deck. Same is true for Tameshi. Like there's some really busted stuff you can do with Tameshi. I think Ursa Saga, Standstill, those kinds of things. But you can also just play Tameshi and draw extra cards off your bounce lands, or recur some artifact creature just so that you can have a persistent board state. And I think that's kind of neat. These like scaling build arounds.
Do you find that having cards with that kind of flexibility and that kind of power make it easier or harder to make changes to the list?
Um, okay, well, as far as like combo centric cards, I do make a concerted effort not to put any 2 card combos in the cube because they would just be far too consistent, right? Like if I put Splinter Twin in here and you could just companion Pestermite or something, like that would be no good. Um, so like there are some incredibly strong 2 card synergies. Like you can ephemerate a grief in this cube, for example, or you can companion life death and try and make a turn 2 Gristlebrand, things like that. But there's nothing that's just going to win you the game instantaneously, especially not for any reasonable amount of mana. Like technically speaking, you could companion Mindslaver and have an Emery in your deck, and I guess that's strictly speaking a 2 card combo, but not in the same way that Splinter Twin is. In terms of making changes to the cube, I actually found it surprisingly easy to make changes to this cube compared to other cubes that I've maintained because the added degree of consistency from the companion rule change actually it means that all of the packages are like really tiny, right? Like if you wanted to, just as an example, I just added this Asmo food package to the cube in my most recent update,
You're talking about
and
Asmarana Martica Dice to Nicoldecard?
impressive. Yes, that one.
I devoted an embarrassing amount of time to memorizing that. Sorry.
Well, you got to show it off then. Yeah. So I think if you were trying to put a package to support that kind of thing in a more traditional cube, you'd have to dig really deep on stuff that makes food. You'd have to dig really deep on a lot of payoffs. And I've even seen cubes that go like 20 cards deep on the food package and it still doesn't really do anything. But when I made this update, I'm just like Asmo, Cookbook, Time Sieve, Academy Manufactor, and that was pretty much it. And that's like good enough. Like Cat Oven is another good example of this. Like you can't really just throw Cat Oven in any old cube because it's not going to come together and the cards don't really do anything otherwise. But in this cube, you can just companion the oven, and now like you're already halfway there.
That's pretty amazing. I hadn't considered that as like the companion zone as built-in redundancy for that kind of or for almost any kind of effect.
Yeah, exactly. Like you'll even find, for example, this cube is really light on removal. It's really light on counter magic. It's really light on stuff like cantrips, and that's because if you're a deck that really wants that effect, you just companion it, and I don't have to worry about putting 17 1-drops here for the aggro deck or putting 17 cantrips for the control deck or anything like that, which is something that you really have to pay attention to in a more traditional cube. Like that density of effects is just not something you have to worry about here.
Do you find that more of your list changes come from actual play, or does more of it come from theory crafting over time of like, oh, I think this may be too powerful or not powerful enough?
A little bit of both. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of my inspiration comes from existing constructed decks. So I'll have oftentimes a deck in mind, or like I'll just, watch the latest Bosch and Roll video or whatever and see something cool that I want to test out. But the other thing is that I also get a lot of really useful feedback on that front from drafters because they'll have a card that they associate with this archetype that maybe I've never even heard of. Like maybe I wasn't playing at the time or whatever, or they'll draft they'll draft an archetype that was their pet constructed deck that I don't have any experience with, and they say this didn't feel right. Like, this didn't feel like Miracles because it didn't have this card or something, and so that can be super helpful for me as well. For another example is Cavern Harpy was in the cube as a that was actually a holdover from the original cube. Cavern Harpy is just one of my favorite cards. I was playing it in the old 800 card cube, and we were drafting the cube in an early stage when I hadn't finished making all the changes yet. And one of the drafters was like, "Oh, I saw this cavern harpy. Is there an alert in the cube? And I was like, oh, well, now there is. Like, that's brilliant, right? That kind of thing. So it's really just yeah. A lot of the changes come from constructed, from legacy, from modern.
Do you have a favorite card to play as a companion yourself?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Some of my recent favorites have been definitely Agatha Soul Cauldron. That card is so cracked and goes in so many decks that you wouldn't expect it to. I mean, people have seen it in your traditional kind of hardened scales aggro sort of stuff, like putting a Walking Ballista or an Arcbound Ravager under that card is really powerful. But you can also just exile Gristlebrand with it in this cube or something like that. Yawgmoth, Chainer, those kinds of things. I like doing that weird stuff. You can put Grist under it. I don't know if you've ever seen anyone do that, but
Oh
that
yes,
actually
oh
goes
yes.
infinite with a couple of different cards as well. Um, so that one's been fun. I was also really excited about Beseech the Mirror when that card came out. I was previously playing Bring to Light for some extra support on the Cascade axis, right? But that card was a little bit weak, and then Beseech the Mirror came out, and it's like, oh, this is just like broken Bring to Light, basically. Like we've seen people playing it in Legacy with Gaia's Will and all that kind of stuff. Um, and I've seen a lot of people just like play Beseech the Mirror because they drafted the One Ring and Shieldred and like a couple of other broken four drops, and they just don't know which one is good. So they're just like, yeah, I'll play Beseech. Whichever one is
I'll
good,
just
I'll
put
do
the
that.
menu in my companion zone. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like sometimes this will be Shieldred, sometimes it'll be the One Ring, sometimes it'll be Yawgmoth, and one of those cards will win me the game. I just don't know which one yet.
So as you think about the design process of the companion cube, from like rules applied to an old environment to environment built around the rule to where it is now, what have been the most significant changes you've seen?
I mean, there was a point at which I shifted from taking cards out that were no good for the cube and started putting cards in that were supposed to be in the cube, like which is I suppose mostly just reiterating your question back at you, but that was kind of the turning point, I guess, is when I was like, okay, I have the 360 cards here. I have the rules change. I feel comfortable with like how this works in my head intuitively. Now, let me go out and find all of these cool constructed archetypes. And we had a period of time where I would be like, okay, here's the cube, but I added Amulet Titan to it, and someone would draft Amulet Titan in 3.0, and then I'd be like, cool, here's Dredge, and then someone would draft Dredge in 3.0, and then we'd be like, all right, here's the Hardened Scales package, and then Hardened Scales is the best deck. And yeah, there's a couple people on Cube Talk that probably remember that era of some online testing we did of just like whatever was brand new to the cube, that's what you were supposed to draft because it was broken.
So as you reflect on the project, what have you learned from curating the companion cube that you would share to encourage newer designers?
The first and foremost piece of advice I have for someone who's new to designing cube is just sleeve some cards up and draft them. I know that everybody and their mother has said that exact thing on every single piece of cube media out there, but it's so true. Like you learn so much from that first draft. Like you can stare at this cube cobra spreadsheet as long as you want, but until you actually put the cards in drafters hands and feel what the gameplay is like, you're not going to know anything. And so just like get something on the table is the biggest part. And then as far as cubes with rules changes go, I think it's super important to cut down on any complexity in the cube that doesn't contribute to the identity of the rules change. As I mentioned before, I used to have this cube that had just like a zillion things going on, all these crazy bells and whistles. I don't even there was an anti card in there. I don't think I mentioned that before. It was a lot,
Oh no.
but like we would bring a new drafter to this cube, and we would have to spend like 15 or 20 minutes explaining what was going on with it because there were just so many off the wall cards and weird interactions going on. And I feel like I learned a lot from that experience. Like there is exponential complexity cost to anything that you're changing from what is just the baseline expectation for how cube works. And so if you're going to make this change here, I would say don't make a rules change and then also change. Well, my example was going to be change back to the original companion rules, but that's a terrible example for drafting this cube. Um, like if you're gonna make a turbo cube, don't also make it a desert cube and also change the way the companions work, but only for half the companions because Lurus is broken and um, like figure out what the cube is and stay true to that vision because that's what makes it a compelling piece of game design.
In the process of working on this, since it, as you described, it kind of underwent a non-traditional development process. Are there pieces of that you would draw from to use for other more traditional environments?
I thought that this process was useful to me because again, I just needed a playground for the rules change. And I think if I had to go back and do it again, I would just test the rules change with an existing queue and then with that intuition in mind, just like start from scratch. And I think that would have probably made the whole thing a lot easier on me. Like just, okay, now I have a feel for this. I'm going to open up a new cube here and start loading in all of my constructed archetypes that I think are cool. But as I mentioned earlier, I also think that cloning a cube and making changes is a really good way to get started, especially if it's a cube that you already know aligns with what you want out of your cube. Like when I started Atomic Cube, I knew that my preferred gameplay patterns were very very similar to Andy's, and so it was reasonable for me to start there because I already knew that this cube was going to offer most of what I wanted, and it would be a great jumping off point for me.
What's next for you as a designer or as a player?
Well, I'm looking forward to a lot of Magic events this year for sure. I'm going to be at both of the Magic cons that are happening in the US, a couple of smaller things along the East Coast, and I intend to be at CubeCon 2024. So excited for just seeing friends, drafting Cube, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I don't have any major design projects in the works right now, but I've started polishing some more battle boxes and other smaller like Dan like experiences. And yeah, maybe inspiration will strike before October rolls around and I'll have a new project to show off there. But for now, just trying to make Companion Cube as good as I can.
And people can often find you at those events with the eponymous companion cube as a physical object that you carry the deck in.
That is true. I'm easy to spot at the cons. If you see a roughly 8-inch by 8-inch cube that looks like a companion cube, then I am probably the one holding it, and it probably contains this cube.
If people would like to follow up on more of the companion cube or other projects you're working on, what would be the best place for them to check out?
So you can find the cube on Cube Cobra, of course. It's the short ID is Companion Cube, all one word, and you can find my other stuff under my username, which is Dinrova Horror, also all one word. And yeah, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Discord. You can feel free to DM me or find me in any of the oh god, probably 10 plus cube servers that are floating around at this point. I'm in all of them, so say hi.
And then as a quick wrap up question, if you could have any card printed as a judge promo, which card would it be and who would you have do the illustration?
Ooh, that's a fun question. I'm gonna cheat a little bit, and I'm gonna say that I hope for a Judge promo reprint of some of the Mystical Archive arts because all of those arts are really really gorgeous, and I just do not like the frame at all. But yeah, if we could get like that brainstorm or that demonic tutor or something like that in a nice normal magic frame, that would be beautiful.
Well, Greg, this has been a delight. Thank you again for your time and for sharing about the Companion Cube and sharing the Companion Cube. Excited to have some opportunities to play it online, in person, and wherever the opportunity strikes.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for chatting with me. I hope to see you and many other cube people at various magic events over the next year, and we can get some drafts together.